In chapter 3, section 3 of Griffin's On Human Rights, we're considering, are human rights co-possible? Griffin doesn't think they are, but he wants to consider this. And he thinks that Kant has the best case for a co-possibility of human rights. Remember, the idea is that they're co-possible means that they all can fit together. They don't really conflict. If you ever find what you think is a conflict, that's an apparent conflict. But if you really got it right, you'd have this nice harmony of human rights and you wouldn't get any of these conflicts. So they're co-possible, right? There's nothing that blocks them from all being happening at the same time, and no worries, they don't conflict. Well, let's think about Griffin's analysis. And again, I'm just sketching it. And admittedly, he doesn't really go in. He more or less rejects it without serious, I would say, serious argument. So, which would require really digging into Kant, and he's not doing that. But well, let's sort of get a feel for what Griffin's up to. He thinks Kant has the best case for co-possibility of human rights. Now, Kant uses the term natural right, where we would say human rights. So we kind of get used to that in the text. And Kant derives the notion of a natural right. Kant derives his human rights from the sole innate right that we have in virtue of being a subject, and that is freedom. Now, Kant's notion of freedom is multi-leveled and very complicated because it includes two kinds of freedom. One is empirical and one is transcendental. Now, the transcendental notion of freedom fortunately, not necessary for us to worry about here. That's a whole thing that's analyzed in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. And it's a certain kind of ego that we all have, which is called a transcendental ego, not surprisingly. And the transcendental ego has what's called transcendental freedom. We're looking more here at Kant's politics here, but it's still grounded in an a priori notion of freedom, but this is more like the freedom to make up one's own mind, free of coercion, in that sense. So let's think about this. So for Kant, as I said, he derives the notion of a natural right from this freedom. Well, for Kant, freedom entails a whole list of these natural rights, and there's quite a few of them, right? Now remember, Griffin was more in line with the Enlightenment. He wanted to look at the Enlightenment's notion and construct what he thinks is a teleological version of human rights that's more in line with the Enlightenment's notion, which, yeah, pays some respect to Kant, but it's not a Kantian notion of human rights. Still, well, one thing, because Griffin doesn't think you can have a co-possible system of human rights, whereas Kant says you can. So Kant's natural rights form a co-possible set. That is, I'm kind of repeating myself here, but trying to push the point of non-conflicting rights. And these are absolute. There's no trade-offs, right? So they have their own little zones, no trade-offs. So they're absolute rights. And Griffin says that if you look, well, the set, I'm going to put parentheses here, do a little bit of math if you don't mind. The set of Kant's natural rights, so this whole laundry list of them, they're absolute, right? They're co-possible, absolute, harmonious, lovely little package there. Okay, this is much greater than, a much bigger set, right? Many more elements, that is, than the Enlightenment set of human rights. And the Enlightenment set is not only smaller, they're not absolute either. So they could conflict and be traded off. And I put a little gamma superscript here because I want to refer back. So what we've got then is Griffin saying Kant gives us the best case. He doesn't argue that Kant gives us the best case. He just says it. Does Kant give us the best case? Some people might say no, but that's part presupposed. You can't do everything. So Kant gives us, according to Griffin, the best case. We get this large set that's bigger than the Enlightenment set. It's absolute, harmonious. This is not absolute, not harmonious. And it's supposedly. Now, Griffin says, look, I don't think that he does pull this off. So Griffin is saying, I don't think Kant manages to get all of this. It doesn't really work. In other words, the set of Kant's natural rights derived from this concept of freedom is not really a co-possible set. Why? Because ultimately this is grounded on the heavy machinery. And if you've ever studied Kant, you know what I mean by Kant's heavy machinery. He's got Well, he sometimes calls it the architectonic of reason, but in any case, he's got the categorical imperative doctrine of right. So Griffin, this is Griffin's representation, is that Kant's machinery is what gets him, or is what Kant's set of natural rights is ultimately founded on. So he needs all of this. The notion of freedom, the categorical imperative doctrine of rights, that's how he gets this set. And by just saying, leading, Griffin says no to this. I'm not convinced by all this machinery. So, well, if the machinery is the basis for all the stuff of the natural rights and you're saying no to the machinery, well, then whether or not the natural rights stuff is true, you're certainly rejecting that route to those natural rights. It certainly doesn't refute the natural rights, but it certainly makes them less plausible if you can yank out the platform. You might need a different argument to get to that set. That's possible. So remember, just because you refute an argument for a particular conclusion, that doesn't mean you've necessarily refuted the conclusion. You've just refuted that route to that way. So, if I tell you a way to get somewhere and you say, that's not how you get there, that doesn't refute that that doesn't prove that there's no other way. You might need to go a different way to get there. So Griffin kind of slides a little bit quickly on that one, but he doesn't think that you're going to get this co-possible one. However, given that he's trying to be flexible and maybe, responding to the criticism I just made, well, maybe there's a different way. He says, well, look, I reject Kant's notion. I want to stick with the Enlightenment one. I reject Kant's notion of this set of co-possible natural rights because I ultimately reject, this machinery underpinning it. But for the sake of discussion, Griffin is saying, okay, suppose we could suppose that Griffin is wrong. So Griffin admits, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe why don't we just go with this compossible set? Maybe Kant does get this compossible set. Why don't we just go with that, right? What if that does work? So why don't we go with this guy and dump gamma? In other words, why not? Maybe this does work, and so we should go with that and dump this guy, right? Why not? Why can't we do that? Well, Griffin wants to give us a little answer. He'd say, well, okay, fine, maybe this Kantian machinery works and all that, but just because you've shown me that maybe the Kantian machinery works and you get this big set, it is a big set, right? That's not necessarily saying that just because it's a big set of absolute co-possible rights, that doesn't force me to drop this one, right? Now, you'd say, well, you'd have to motivate me at least. If this one has been nicely grounded and all that, you'd have to motivate me at least for keeping this one and not going with this one. So where do we go with this? Well, Griffin says, well, look, this set of rights, this set of human rights, it's not absolute and all that, fine. But it's actually worked quite well. And he says that, yeah, we've produced clashes, right? In the previous video, we've produced a clash. This one can't handle clashes. It says they shouldn't happen. This one says clashes can happen. So that's kind of even if this goes through, maybe there is some other flaw somewhere, but we want to take into account, we want to have an understanding of human rights that accounts for real clashes of human rights and doesn't just simply write them off as apparent and move somewhere else and say, well, they're apparent and we've got an answer. No, the Enlightenment set seems to correspond more closely to maybe our intuitions or maybe our experience. Yeah, there really are clashes. So that's a sort of in favor of this one and cuts against this one, right? So that we can generate real clashes, cuts against Kant's project. And also, Griffin says, not only does the existence of real clashes cut against this and in favor of this, let's also think about the fact that this one works quite well. It's been at the basis of a lot of our thinking for quite a few years now. So in that sense, it seems to work well. So you've got something that seems to conform to our experience better than something else and to work really well. So again, I don't think it's a total knockdown argument, but this is why Griffin tends to move away from Kant and towards more of more of an Enlightenment set of human rights, which, as we've seen, are not absolute, they can clash, and that reflects our experience better.